Welcome to another fun-filled episode of Real Business Cycles and NyQuil or something. I don't know. Either way, last time we figured out how to get the aggregate supply curve. This time we're going to be getting the aggregate demand curve. There will be one more lecture covering the shocks, or really responses to certain types of shocks in this model. And then we'll have an exam. Now, to address the elephant that's in the room, and not the pink one because we drank too much NyQuil, but the actual legit elephant in the room. I realize that some of the material that I've been covering has been extremely difficult, and I think I got a little carried away. I got a little overzealous with some of this stuff, and I thought it would be teachable in an online context. Unfortunately, without real-time feedback to see how everybody's doing and how everybody's handling this material and whatnot, it became pretty much impossible to do. Therefore, I want you to know that from here on out, the course will be much simpler. It will be much easier. I will not be focusing on having to do a bunch of calculus with dynamic general equilibrium models. They're still important and they'll still be used, although it's going to be more intuition-based than it will be math-based. So if you don't know how to differentiate these things, if you don't know how to formulate the constraint, don't worry about it. All of that will be taken care of. All you will have to do is know what some of the derivatives are. You won't have to take any derivatives. You just need to know what the derivatives are. When you see the exam, you will know what I mean. And you will have to interpret some of the results, like some of the steady state results, what some of the steady state properties are of the real business cycle model, and things like that. But because I understand I got a little overzealous, I think I was kind of swinging for the fences on some of this stuff, and I think the fact that being fresh out of graduate school, where this stuff is second nature to me, I think I sort of mistakenly assumed that because it's second nature to me, it's second nature to everybody. And I kind of forgot that I kind of had to work my ass off to be able to understand this material. So as soon as that became apparent to me, it was incumbent upon me to adjust things accordingly and to let you know that I made a mistake and that I'll be fixing the mistake. And from here on out, the material should be much easier to digest, and any homework that you have will be much easier to complete because I don't want to scare you guys off. Right? I don't want to scare you off. I don't want you to think you have no idea what's going on. You're totally lost in the course. Trust me, I've been there. That's the scariest feeling in the world, and that's just not something I'm going to do to anybody ever. So with that out of the way, let's talk about how to find aggregate demand. So we want to find aggregate demand. We're not doing it with this marker. That marker is a piece of shit. Instead, we're going to do it with a different marker. Now, last time we found aggregate supply, I showed you the entire process on how to find that. The book is going to go through some formulations of certain curves, namely the IS curve and the LM curve. It's going to go through some formulations on that. I wouldn't worry about that. That will give you a deeper understanding of what's going on should you be interested in sort of seeing how they're formulated. But what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be starting from the IS and the LM curves, and we're going to derive aggregate demand in a way that is consistent with what you see in the book. So this is, again, just pure graphing. If you can understand these graphs, then you will get the intuition of a majority of the real business cycle model. So without further ado, let's get moving. Now, with aggregate demand, definitely not doing it with that marker. Whoop, piece of shit. What we need to do is understand the demand side of the economy. We need to know what's making up the demand side of the economy. right? This is where a lot of the dynamic optimization stuff came into play, right? Because we were trying to figure out the demand side before we did any supply side stuff. Now, but the demand side, right? That's where the Euler equation came from. It's how we figured out what consumption, or the flow of consumption was going to be over time. And there's a lot of math we can do, plugging stuff back into the constraints, all that, where we can get like an aggregate demand equation, right? Now, the aggregate demand equation itself, right? So when we think demand, that's just, individual household demand for stuff. Aggregate demand is, well, aggregated individual demand. But the way it's derived in macro theory is a little different than the way it's derived in, like, say, micro theory. The intuition is still the same. The mathematical formulation varies a little bit. Therefore, if we're going to be looking at this in sort of like a graphing context, right, it's going to look a little different. But at the end of the day, there's still individual optimization going on. Households are still optimizing. Firms are still optimizing. When households optimize, that's where the demand side of the system comes from. Now, it's really from the intersection of two curves. The IS curve, called IS for investment equals savings curve, and it's the set of all equilibrium points where goods markets clear. Right, so if we're thinking GDP, right, the demand side of GDP, C plus I plus G, right, will be reflected in the IS curve. So, because we've got C, I, and G in there, consumption, if there's a shock to preferences for consuming rather than saving, well, that would show up in the IS curve. If that happens, right, it shows up through preferences to consume more and save less. Consumption goes up, investment goes down. Now, by that same token, if there's a shock where we want to consume less and save more, well, investment's going to go up, consumption's going to go down, right? But that's still occurring on the demand side of the economy. Now, finally, government. Yeah, government. When there's a government spending shock or a fiscal policy shock, whether it's a cut in taxes, right, an increase in taxes, whether there's an increase in spending, whether there's a decrease in spending, that's going to be reflected in the IS curve, right? In the IS curve, is a function of output and interest rates. Okay, so we can sort of write it like IS equals, I don't know, F of Y and R, right? Because the inputs, or not the inputs, but the axes that it's defined on are going to be the real interest rate, RT, and output Y, or income, right? Now, the IS curve, as you will see if you read through this stuff in the book, right, is a set of all interest rate and output combinations where goods markets clear. Therefore, the IS curve is downward sloping in interest rates, right? If we think about this from the demand side of the economy, C plus I plus G, if interest rates increase, what happens to output? Well, if interest rates go up, think about just in the economy in general, right? You always hear, well, interest rates are going to do whatever, and that's going to screw the economy. What does that mean? Well, when interest rates go up, cost of borrowing increases. Therefore, the return on savings will increase. Consumption falls and savings will go up. So if we enter a recession where consumption falls and we save more, which typically is seen within a recession, right? There's sort of a reallocation within all the different markets in the macroeconomy as the economy is slowing down and agents are trying to sort of figure out how to re-optimize in a way. When that happens, right, interest rates go up, savings increases, consumption falls, the economy slows a little bit, and then over time it sort of begins to pick back up. Once we've saved, credit becomes more readily available, and firms kind of have a little bit better of an idea of what to do. Therefore, the IS curve is downward sloping. Now, that's just one part of aggregate demand. There's another part that we need to consider. So we got the IS curve, which is downward sloping. So as interest rates increase, output falls. So the first one was the IS curve. The second one is what's known as the LM curve, where LM stands for liquidity preference of money curve. And this curve instead of being the set of all interest rate output combinations where goods markets are in equilibrium, where goods markets are clearing, instead what this is giving us is a set of all interest rate output combinations where money markets are clearing. So what's the difference? Well, the IS curve, right, which reflects all combinations where goods markets are clearing, reflects fiscal policy, right? That reflects changes in fiscal policy. It reflects more than that, but fiscal policy changes, fiscal policy shocks, will enter the model through the IS curve. On the other hand, the LM curve represents all real interest rate output combinations where money markets clear. Therefore, monetary policy shocks will originate through the LM curve, not the IS curve. So if we've got fiscal policy on one side, monetary policy on the other, fiscal policy is reflected through movements or shifts in the IS curve. Monetary policy is reflected through movements or shifts in the LM curve, right? If you have a hard time remembering which one's which, IS is government, LM, money, liquidity preference of money, LM, right? Think like M, money, L, money, or whatever mnemonic device you want to use. It's a particularly shitty one, I think, but whatever. Whatever helps you, LM, monetary policy, IS, fiscal policy. Now, the IS curve is downward sloping. The LM curve, right, we get a set of all these points where money markets are in equilibrium. Right? The higher the interest rate, the more money you're going to want to hold. Therefore, it will be upward sloping and it is a function of the price level PT, and money, MT. Now it's increasing in money, right, or the money supply. Therefore, if the money supply were to increase, the LM curve shifts to the right. Conversely, we're looking at the IS curve. Then, if government spending were to increase, the IS curve will also shift to the right. So if there's a government spending shock, a positive government spending shock, the IS curve shifts to the right. There's a positive monetary policy shock, change of the money supply. The IS curve will shift, well, to the right. So how do we get aggregate demand from all this stuff? Right? Because we've figured out, okay, well, I get an intersection of all equilibrium points where goods markets clear and money markets clear. Right? They're linear. One's upward sloping, one's downward sloping, which guarantees there is a unique stable equilibrium point here. At this point, right, we'll call it R star. This is an equilibrium interest rate and equilibrium output. The YT star, and that star is going to go off to the side. You're going to want to keep it off to the side. Well, what we do here, remember last time we just sort of drew some graphs on top of each other because, well, some of the axes matched up. If you remember the horizontal axes with like labor markets and output and all that stuff, the horizontal axes were the same. So if the horizontal axes were the same, well, we could just draw graphs right on top of each other, and we can do the exact same thing here. You can have output on the horizontal and price level on the vertical. Now, let's trace this guy all the way down. We're going to trace it to like, I don't know, here. That looks like a good place to stop. So we'll stop there. Right? Now, we could either shift the IS curve or the LM curve. It doesn't particularly matter because no matter which one we move around, we'll be able to trace out aggregate demand. So, which one do we want to do? Well, let's see what the book gives us. Well, the book has us shifting the LM curve, so we're going to shift the LM curve. So we're going to let the LM curve shift to the right. So if it shifts to the right, it means there's something changing. It's not the interest rate or output, right? There's something else that's changing this. Right, but we need to trace out what's happening for aggregate demand. So we have to look at the this graph here, because this is going to give us aggregate demand, price, and output, right? We get demand, we can also get supply in this graph here. So what can we shift in the LM curve? What can change in the LM curve that will allow us to trace a new point in this price output space? Well, it would have to be a change in the price level. So let's increase the price level from PT to PT1. Well, if we do that, what happens Okay, we'll start this over. So we're going to let the LM curve shift to the right. Now, if it shifts to the right, we're going to want it to shift via a change in something, either in the price level or the money supply. But what we're going to want is something that it will shift in that will allow us to trace an existing point on this aggregate demand curve. Meaning we need something in the aggregate demand curve that aggregate demand is a function of that's showing up in LM. Well, let's look at aggregate demand, right? That aggregate demand graph, the PT, YT. Well, there's a PT there, there's a PT in LM. So, if we were to change the price level as a result of a shift in the LM curve, we would find a new point on an existing aggregate demand curve. Now, currently, it seems like there is no other point on the aggregate demand curve. But there is an aggregate demand curve, we just haven't seen it all yet. We haven't drawn it all out. So if we're going to shift the LM curve to the right, then what has to happen is the price level will fall from PT to, say, PT1. So this tells me as a nice little aside, if the price level falls, the LM curve is going to shift to the right. Conversely, if the price level increases, the LM curve will shift in to the left. Right, so we're going to let the LM curve shift to the right, which means the price level falls. Here's as good a place as any. I'll denote it LM prime, PT prime, MT. Now, there's no change to MT, right? The money supply has not changed. What has happened, though, is the price level has fallen, and the real interest rate has also fallen. So if the LM curve shifts to the right, then the price level has to fall, and to maintain equilibrium, the real interest rate also falls. call it RT prime, and I'm going to trace this down to a point like, I don't know, there. So 2 points can help connect a line. So theoretically, I'd be good here, right? I could just sort of draw a line and be done. Call it aggregate demand. However, just for the sake of completeness, let's allow the price level to increase rather than decrease. Now, if the price level increases, initially, right, when it fell, the LM curve shifted out. But if the price level goes up, what happens is this LM curve shifts in. So it's going to shift from, say, PT1 to PT2. There we go. So if it shifts up, or the price level goes up, the LM curve is going to shift in. And to maintain equality along that IS curve, right, to maintain equilibrium in that IS curve, right, where the two are intersecting, right, the interest rate is going to go up. So if the real interest rate goes up when the price level goes up in response to changes in monetary policy, the real interest rate is going to go up, right? Therefore, if the interest rate goes up, what we're going to be seeing is black works. This nice downward sloping aggregate demand curve, AD. Right, why is it downward sloping for tracing this stuff out? Well, let's think about what happens. If the price level falls, the LM curve shifts out, the real interest rate falls. Right? Now let's trace it down here. What does a lower price level mean when it comes to demand? What happens if there's a lower price level with demand? Well, we're going to want more stuff. Conversely, if the LM curve shifts in as a result of an increase in the price level, well, the real interest rate is going to go up. The real interest rate is going to go up. Price level is going to be going up because initially the price level changed. So with an increase in the price level and an increase in real interest rates, what's going to happen is we're going to want less stuff. At a higher price, you don't want as much as you want at a lower price. So that explains how aggregate demand is downward sloping if we've got this equilibrium right here in both goods markets and money markets. When goods markets are clearing and money markets are clearing, we're in what's known as a general equilibrium. Right? All that fancy general equilibrium modeling stuff that we went over, right? That was dynamic, this is static. But we can use these static models to understand what the dynamic models are trying to tell us. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's going to make a little bit more sense when we actually kind of look at some shocks. But let's go ahead and draw out everything, right? Everything that you will be responsible for on, like, I don't know, an exam or homework or something like that. So what would something like this look like on, like, an exam, on homework, the book, and life in general, anything of that nature? Well, we got a couple of things we want to think about here. Well, if we follow the steps from the last lecture video, right, where I explained how to get aggregate supply. What did we have? We had labor markets. That should be good. We had production, right? So we got labor, LT, on the horizontal axis here, right? I've got output on the vertical axis here, and on the vertical axis here, I have the real wage. Now over here what I had, and if you don't remember this, go back and watch how to derive aggregate supply. Right, I've got this 45-degree line where YT equals YT, output equals output. Anywhere along this 45-degree line, actually not very good 45-degree line, let's make it a little bit better. We'll pretend that's better. Anywhere along that 45-degree line, output equals output. So what it does is it reflects output rather than being on the vertical axis, it flips it down to the horizontal axis, where we can then have output on the horizontal and price on the vertical, like this. So what did we get? Well, when we drew this stuff out, we had labor demand, we had labor supply, LTS and LTD. When labor demand and labor supply were equal, right, we had wage markets, or labor markets clearing at a real wage rate W star. The quantity of labor was L star. I got my production function, y equals AT to the alpha times LT to the 1 minus alpha, right here. So when we drew that dotted line down, we drew it down to this production function, which when labor markets clear and output is determined by the clearing in labor markets, well, this is the level of output that's determined by equilibrium in the labor markets. I'll draw this dotted line over and then up, and booyah, aggregate supply. Right, this is where we were in the last lecture. Now, in this lecture, right, we got the IS and the LM curves, which is a function, or a combination of output and interest rates, where goods markets for IS and money markets for LM, like this, where LM is a function of the price level and money, right? Where these two guys intersected, we got an equilibrium real interest rate. So we had the equilibrium real interest rate, and where the IS and the LM curves intersected, we drew a dotted line down, and that helped us figure out the aggregate demand. Now in equilibrium, right, when there's a general equilibrium, when goods markets are clearing, money markets are clearing, labor markets are clearing, what happens? Well, the IS and the LM curves intersect right on top of this vertical aggregate supply curve. So this vertical aggregate supply curve, where it intersects on top of that, well, that's where aggregate demand is going to fall. So in equilibrium, in a general equilibrium, when labor markets are clearing, goods markets are clearing, money markets are clearing, aggregate demand equals aggregate supply. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect at a market clearing price level, PT star. Goods markets and money markets intersect at an equilibrium interest rate, RT star, equilibrium real interest rate, RT star. Labor markets clear at an equilibrium quantity of labor, L star, at a real wage rate, W star. And this right here is the general equilibrium seen in the real business cycle model. Right? So all those equations that we chugged out earlier translate to this. Now the equations you saw were dynamic. These equations are static. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is if they're dynamic, they're over time. If they're static, well, it's just a snapshot in time. But as you will see, we can use this static framework here to derive implications in a dynamic setting. If we let things change by initiating a shock and then allowing things to respond over a course of multiple periods, via a static set of graphs, we can get an idea for what's going to happen in the event of a dynamic framework, right? And the dynamic responses to shocks. Now this is the simplest of business cycle models. The real business cycle model assumes that aggregate supply, right, production, is independent of prices. It's totally independent of prices. How can I tell? Well, you have perfectly inelastic supply. So no matter what happens to aggregate demand, supply is going to be the same. We're going to look into that a little bit more in the next lecture. This will conclude this particular lecture. The next one we'll look at responses to different types of shocks. There's shocks to production, technology shocks. There are shocks to labor markets, there are government spending shocks, and there are monetary policy shocks. And with all that said, I will conclude this particular video, and we will look at some other videos coming up. Well, actually, one other video that covers all of the shocks that will be of particular interest in this model. So, with that said, I hope you thoroughly enjoyed this lecture. Please accept my most humble apologies for kind of screwing up stuff with the class earlier this semester. We will make the best of it. We will move forward. We will sort of keep going. That's sort of what happens, sort of what you have to do. And we will make the absolute best of this situation, which actually, when I say we, what I really mean is I will make the best of this situation, because my fuck-ups aren't your fault. My mistakes are, well, my fault. So, with that said, I hope you enjoy everything. I hope you like this. And please don't freak, because you'll be fine. If you've been watching the videos, you've been paying attention, you've been making any attempts whatsoever to learn this stuff, you'll be fine. So, just keep at it. I'll keep at it. It's a learning process for both of us. This whole online teaching thing is particularly weird. Thanks, COVID. And so we will conclude all the stuff for the first exam in the next lecture. Thanks for watching.